You as a free individual have the responsibility, the moral and intellectual responsibility to think, what viewpoints do I think are right or rational or reasonable, and what viewpoints and positions and people they should be ostracized.
Gatekeeping isn't just kicking people out, it's inviting people in. Tucker's whole approach to that interview is to normalize. If you watch Fuentes' own show, he comes across like a lunatic. They want these people in the movement. This is part of what they think is the future of the conservative movement. That's part of why it's despicable.
The conservative movement is in an existential crisis of soul-searching, of trying to figure out who is in and who is out, who is a friend and who is an enemy. Here is a very short recap in the latest episode of this drama, in a nutshell. Tucker Carlson, who has been in an increasingly dark trajectory, had on his show Nick Fuentes. Now, who is Nick Fuentes? He's the most prominent voice of anti-Jewish hatred in the United States. And the conversation between Tucker and Fuentes was quite amicable and has had, by this moment, more than 25 million views on X and on YouTube. And soon, of course, questions were raised about Tucker Carlson's association with prestigious institutions within the conservative movement, such as, for example, the Heritage Foundation. And the president of Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, released a video defending Tucker Carlson, and promising that he would never, quote, cancel Tucker. And as a result, there was an internal revolt within Heritage Foundation, with prominent staff, fellows, and even board members resigning, considering the support to Tucker as morally indefensible. And even the president and the vice president of the United States seemed into all this, and actually they took the side of Tucker Carlson, and they decried, quote-unquote, infighting. This is fighting among people supposedly in the same team. Now, this whole saga has raised important questions in the minds of many people. For example, when does one's views place them beyond the moral pale of what is acceptable? Should one disavow someone for speaking to bad actors? And what does it mean to, quote, cancel someone? And how does it relate to the principles of free speech? But perhaps even more importantly, how does one deal with the prominence of figures like Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes? Should one debate them, and under what terms? So today, in the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast, with our senior intellectuals, with Onkar, with Ben, and with Elan, we will try to shed light to all this. And Onkar, let me start with you. Why is this whole Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, Heritage Foundation drama, why is this significant?
It goes really to what you said in the intro. I mean, think of what you brought up, that this is about the soul of what will be labeled as either the conservatives or the political right in America, and thinking about, like, what is their nature? What is that soul? It's at the level of the president and the vice president of the United States weighing in on this issue. I mean, that makes it significant if you're trying to understand their views, their movement, which they will call the MAGA movement. So it's important politically. Then we've got the issue of a rise of racism. And part of the way the conservatives and the right paint themselves as we're responding to the racism on the left of Black Lives Matters and those protests and so on, and we're an antidote to that. And now people are worrying about the rise of anti-Semitism, another form of racism, and wondering, like, is this part of the process by which anti-Semitism becomes more legitimate, more mainstream? Is what Tucker doing, is that what the process looks like? That you're giving, even if Tucker doesn't agree fully with it, is the way that he did this interview, in effect, making it look relatively benign. It's not true that Tucker Carlson didn't push back at all in the interview. He did a bit, but you said, if you put it something like in the intro, relatively friendly or basically friendly. And so there's that kind of issue. Then there's issues about understanding free speech, which is vital to understanding the United States and the Constitution. Is like, are we engaging in cancel culture, and is that anti-free speech? And then just thinking much more broadly about, well, is it really that we've got racism now on both sides? Are we descending into a real tribal animosity? And I think anybody who like doesn't situate themselves, I'm part of MAGA, I'm part of the far left, is wondering like what is happening in our political and cultural environment. And so this is a significant episode because of it involves those kinds of current issues and trends.
Elan?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about what is the state of the conservative movement or the MAGA movement. And I think one way to look at it is the conservative movement has been swallowed up by MAGA, and the Trump phenomenon and whatever comes after Trump, I think, is the defining feature of this coalition. I actually want to start with something which I think is deeper and more significant, that goes to why people are so upset. And that's the issue of the moral sanction here, which is, how could Kevin Roberts say this is okay, we're never going to cut ties with Tucker Carlson? How could he platform Fuentes? What does it mean that he did this? And how should one think of the ways in which Tucker went on after the fact to try to defend himself or justify it? So, because I think this is the moral issue that is generic. So it arises in all movements. It arises in life in general. It isn't restricted to political, ideological movements. And it has to do with how you deal with people that you have negative judgments about and positive judgments about, and how do you engage with them. I raise this because this is something that's central to Ayn Rand's thought. It's a major part of Atlas Shrugged. It's in her nonfiction writings. She didn't originate this issue that we have to think about moral judgment. I think people recognize this as an issue in life, but she has the deepest analysis of it that I've ever encountered. I think it's really central to how to think about life. One aspect of it it's really significant for this conversation, is that her view of moral sanction is sophisticated, and it's informed by her moral view of right and wrong. And specifically the idea that the evil is impotent. It is parasitic on the good. It's parasitic on getting endorsement, whitewashing, encouragement, cover from those who are in a better moral standing. And I think that is really how to frame this issue, which is, what is the agenda of Carlson? What is the agenda of Heritage? What is going on in that movement? You can't really start to understand it without thinking about the role of moral sanction and what is being whitewashed, what is being mainstreamed here with putting Fuentes on what is essentially the biggest podcast. I think it's eclipsed most other political podcasts in the country for a long time. So to me, this just to amplify what Onkar was saying, that this aspect of it, this moral issue, to me, it overshadows even the political one about where is the conservative movement going, because there's something really sick and morally corrupt in what we saw in that interview, and I don't think people have even come close to appreciating how corrupt it is.
One way of putting these two points together, the question about the conservative movement and the question about the morality of association and disassociation, is, how does it get to be if, in fact, the fact that this controversy has reached such a high level in the movement, that this rot has reached such a deep level, if that's a sign that something's gone wrong with the movement, what does that mean about how it's been managed up to this point? How does it happen that this rot goes this deep? And the kind of messaging that we've been getting from Roberts lately is, in effect, and the way many people have described it, is no enemies to the right of me. And in other words, anybody the left is the enemy, and anybody who is allied with me against the left, we see as an ally, regardless of, what their motivations might be, regardless of what their philosophical sympathies might be. And I mean, if that's really the attitude, you can imagine what might have led this rot to go so deep, because it's in effect a kind of moral agnosticism. It's in effect a unwillingness to morally judge people in your midst just because you happen to share a certain enemy. And I mean, I think that's the unwillingness that Elon was just referencing, that Ayn Rand and her philosophy was so opposed to. And it's something that we at the Ayn Rand Institute have taken very seriously, the need to judge people morally for not just their overt actions, but also for their ideas. Because part of why we judge different political and philosophical movements the way we do is because of this concern. And it's, for example, the reason why objectivism has been very critical of the libertarian movement, in spite of having certain, kind of superficial similarities and having certain enemies in common. We think there's a basic kind of philosophic corruption that's at the heart of many central aspects of that movement. And just as a footnote, I would add, I think it's interesting, if you watch that interview with between Carlson and Fuentes, that one of the things that Fuentes himself reveals in telling his kind of intellectual autobiography is that he started out as a Ron Paul libertarian. And the way that movement has been a big tent in the past, which it looks like the conservative movement is also treating itself as, well, that kind of big tent attitude, if it can be accommodating to someone like Fuentes, who's now coming into full blossom as a kind of anti-Semite, pro-Nazi, well, that's the consequence of that kind of morally agnostic attitude.
And it's not only with Tucker Carlson that Nick Fuentes had a discussion. Recently, he had, again, a very amicable discussion with a libertarian, with Dave Smith. And they start the discussion by saying, well, we both are opposed to Israel, therefore, we can talk. But since libertarianism is not our topic today, one question that one might have at this point is this one, gentlemen. Someone could say, okay, but is merely debating someone, is merely having an interview and one-on-one with someone, does this mean that we give them a sanction? And many brought the examples of heated debates of the past. For example, I went down a rabbit hole and I watched some interviews between William Buckley and some people who back in the day and even today would be considered beyond the pale, segregationists, terrorists, eugenicists, Black Panthers. And these discussions between Buckley and them, the difference is that they didn't just have entertainment value. They were actually quite didactic, because Buckley was, whatever one might think about him, was pushing them and trying to reveal their true premises. Like, what do you really believe about? Where would your views lead if they were applied? And he tried to push back and oppose them. Or recently, I saw a very good interview between Coleman Hughes exposing the ignorance of Dave Smith in their one-on-one interview. So surely we cannot be saying that merely debating or interviewing or giving a platform to someone means giving them a moral sanction that they don't deserve. Am I right?
I mean, a lot of it depends a great deal on the circumstances. But I mean, the principle here is there's no good reason to give a platform to or attention to or support for somebody who, without your help, would not wreak as much destruction as they ordinarily would. Now, the Buckley versus Chomsky debates and various others that you mentioned are perhaps not the best example here, because, I mean, it's not like we should think of ourselves in the place of Buckley and who would we like to platform, because I mean, we see platforming Buckley as itself a problem. And I think Chomsky was making a mistake by platforming Buckley. But leaving that aside, I mean, neither of them deserved a kind of platform. And there's one thing to have a conversation with somebody in private who you happen to know and you want to learn something from them. It's quite a different thing to when there's somebody whose viewpoint, for any number of reasons, you think is irrational and destructive, to amplify their voice when you think that amplifying that destructive and irrational voice is going to cause destruction in the world. Now, there's a lot of cases where you disagree with someone, and it's not that that you think that they're irrational and destructive, and you can have a lot of debates with a lot of people that you disagree with, privately or publicly, where you're not amplifying something destructive. But there are cases where you are. I mean, I think something like platforming a neo-Nazi, which is in effect the way I think about Nick Fuentes, is a major example of that.
But what about you have a discussion with them to show the world how bad they are? I mean, I caught myself many times saying, God, I wish Yaron or Ilan would have a discussion with Dave Smith and put him on his place, no?
So it's not just an issue of platforming. It's an issue of when you deal with someone in a civilized way, and having a debate is you're treating the person as he's in the realm of the intellectual. And we disagree, and we might strongly disagree, and you might think, well, even some of his positions are evil, but he's still someone worth debating. And that means something. Like that you view it like that means something. You're conveying something by the very fact of being there and debating. You're conveying this is a debatable issue. In Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, there's a scene where one of the heroes or heroines, Dagny, is told, like, you have to go on the on the radio to debate someone about a question that she views as the very question is irrational. And she says, I'm not going to do it because it's not I'm platforming the other person. It's I'm conveying by engaging in the debate as though I view the question as debatable when I don't. I view that person as completely irrational. So there's a false alternative here when people think about these issues, because these are real moral issues of who do I associate in what kind of way, and what is that association, because it's freely chosen. What does it convey about my viewpoint? And I can say, oh yeah, I think anti-Semitism and denial of the Holocaust, that's evil. But then if you're going to debate with someone about it, do you really put it in the category of evil if you think we now have to have a discussion and a debate about the fine points of this? But the false alternative is it's not true that the only way to engage with evil viewpoints is to have debates with people and discussions, even heated discussions with people. So I'll give you from Ayn Rand's perspective. I guarantee she would not have debated Immanuel Kant if they both had been alive at the same time. She viewed his philosophy as evil, as anti-Enlightenment, as what helped destroy the Enlightenment's achievements intellectually and then politically as well. She put him in a category of abysmal evil, like a Marx or a Lenin or Stalin and a Hitler. She would not have debated him, but she did talk about his ideas and how irrational they are, and she exposed the irrationality of them and the gimmicks that he was using, how he could prey on wrong ideas and errors of the Enlightenment to push his irrational viewpoint. So it's not like, oh, you can't talk about it, or you have to have a friendly discussion with the people or debate them. That's a false alternative. You can engage with evil ideas and yet still convey that you regard them as evil, and so these people as beyond the pale.
Right. So you can criticize someone, you don't have to be on the same room and have a discussion with them. Yeah. Now, let's move to another big confusion that there's out there. This confusion between canceling, quote, censorship and free speech. And this is a very important discussion to have. We need clarity on these terms because confusion opens the gate to bad actors to claim an undeserved victim status. So if you watch the interviews of Nick Fuentes, his origin story, which he repeats in every podcast, goes something like this. Oh, I was cancelled from the gatekeepers of conservatism, from the likes of Ben Shapiro. They censored me. I lost my platforms, and no one stood for my right to free speech. And then remember, the president of Heritage Foundation said that canceling Nick Fuentes is not the answer. That were his words. So, gentlemen, cancel culture, censorship, free speech, there seems to be a lot of conceptual confusion here. So who wants to have a go at untangling all this?
I'll say a few things first. I think that the attempt to conceptualize this whole controversy in terms of cancel culture or its absence is a confused way of even beginning the conversation. And it goes back to, and it points to, I think, what are some basic flaws in that conceptualization in the first place. And there's a real phenomenon. I think that phrase, cancel culture, was at least trying to, or pretending to try to capture, going back to 2020 and the George Floyd protests and the many kind of the behavior of the especially the campus left in connection with those controversies. There were campaigns to fire people, to expel people because they said the wrong thing, because they didn't adhere to the academically orthodox ideology when how to think about George Floyd, et cetera, and related issues. There's a real phenomenon there that needs understanding. Thinking of it as cancel culture is problematic for a number of reasons. And you start to see why when you see how they think about this latest episode. Because as you referenced, Nikos, Kevin Roberts said, no, I don't want to engage in cancel culture. That's why I don't want to disassociate with Carlson. It's noteworthy, by the way, he also says the solution to dealing with Fuentes is not to, quote, cancel him, even if we disagree with him. It makes you wonder, well, what is the solution? And when critics of Roberts push back against this, there were several articles, for example, in Barry Weiss's magazine, The Free Press, where they say, no, that's ridiculous. It's not cancel culture to, in effect, police the boundaries of your movement and to expel from polite society people who are irrational and destructive and immoral. And then the question is, okay, well, why isn't it cancel culture? And what is this cancel culture that you have in mind? And what you had in those articles was, well, the series of examples of what it was and what it wasn't. So, for example, one article by Ellie Lake said, cancellation is when an editor gets fired for writing a headline, buildings matter too, at the height of the George Floyd protests. Cancellation is when a high school student gets her college admission revoked because a few tasteless social media posts from earlier years are dredged up by his spiteful fellow students, but criticizing a powerful conservative influencer by giving a chummy interview to a guy who regularly drops the N-word in his live streams and recycles ancient tropes about Jewish control of the government is not cancel culture. Okay, there's definitely a difference between these examples, a major difference. The first set of things that the left did after 2020 seems like pretty bad and irrational things, whereas, expelling or ostracizing Fuentes sounds like totally appropriate. But what actually makes the difference? What is cancel culture even supposed to be? And the best definition, kind of abstract definition that I've been able to find that anyone's offered to conceptualize what was happening around 2020 is in this book by Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott, Canceling of the American Mind, which is the closest to anything I know of as a kind of textbook on the alleged phenomenon of cancel culture. The way they define it is, in essence, campaigns to get people fired, disinvited, deplatformed, or otherwise punished for speech that is or would be protected by First Amendment standards and the climate of fear and conformity that's resulted from it. And certainly that characterizes a lot of what happened after 2020, around 2020, that I think many of us regard as irrational and ridiculous and, something that should be stopped. But here's the thing. Is Nick Fuentes' speech, his racist, anti-Semitic speech, is that protected by the First Amendment? I think it is. But that means that according to this definition, where the better conservatives are trying to push Fuentes out of their movement, they are in fact trying to deplatform him for speech that is protected by the First Amendment. But that means that it is called cancel culture by this definition. And so if this definition is by its nature packaging together ostracizing someone like Fuentes with ostracizing people who aren't Nazis when someone pretends that they are, this definition is not very helpful. It's not very useful. It's packaging together very different things. And it makes me think that this is just a poor way of conceptualizing it. We need something better. I mean, I think we have a better term that identifies the real problem with 2020, and it's something like witch hunting or inquisitions, casting out of heretics, which points to the fact that the problem is you're policing your movement or you're policing polite society on the basis of, in effect, irrational kind of religious, ideological orientations. It's interesting, though, that it doesn't get conceptualized this way by many critics of cancel culture today, because I think that would force them to think about, well, if the real problem is a religious attitude, is this only a problem that we saw on the left in 2020? Or is this, of course, an ancient historical problem that's as old as religion itself, and the left has just recently been starting to mimic an old religious practice? And and of course, you've seen the right do the same thing in many cases. And I think you saw it, for instance, after the Charlie Kirk assassination. There were many people who did many inappropriate things after Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Some of them probably did deserve to be fired because they celebrated the assassination or said really uncouth things. But some of them were fired and expelled from schools and universities just because they stated their disagreement with Kirk's views. And so there was a kind of witch hunt culture that was associated. It might not have been as extensive as the left's was ever in academia, but it's there too. And the free speech issue is not the essential issue here. The issue is, do we regard the kind of ostracism as a kind of irrational religious heresy hunting or not? And it's not religious heresy hunting to kick out someone like Fuentes. If anything, he is himself a kind of religious tribalist witch hunter, as evidenced by his anti-Semitism. He's always looking to root out the various Jewish interests that he sees as behind all the ills in society. And so, in effect, it's rational to kick out the witch hunters in your movement, but not, and that's a very different thing from the witch hunters themselves.
So what you just said, Ben, brought an idea in my mind, which I'll put on the table for Onkar and Elan to give me their comment. So it looks like, obviously, for example, if tomorrow I wake up and I decide I'm a Marxist, you people should kick me out of this podcast. And this shouldn't be considered censorship or cancel culture. Because what happens is it's very clear what this podcast and the Ayn Rand Institute stands for. Therefore, me being a Marxist, you would judge rightly that this guy should not be in this movement. So we're doing gatekeeping. Off you go, Nikos. Could it be that the problem is that there's not much gatekeeping in the conservative movement because it's not clear at all what they stand for? It's not clear at all what are the principles that define who is an insider and who is an outsider. So what do you think, Onkar and Elan?
I think that's some of what's going on, but the three issues here of giving sort of a moral approval. So moral sanction means you're giving, in some sense, moral approval to people, to viewpoints, to causes, that you're treating them as, even if you don't fully agree with them, you're treating them as, this is a respectable viewpoint, or I view it as a benign viewpoint, or I view this as, this is a reasonable disagreement that we should hash out. That's what we're talking about. When we're talking about moral sanction, issues of freedom of speech, and part of why the conceptualizing it as cancel culture is distorting, is they don't separate out what the First Amendment really means is government has no power to do this, but which means you as a free individual have the responsibility, the moral and intellectual responsibility to think, what viewpoints do I think are right or rational or reasonable. I want to support those viewpoints. I want to support discussion of those viewpoints. I want to hear more of that. And what viewpoints and positions and people do I think as no, they shouldn't get support. They should be denounced. They should be ostracized. It's the government can't do this. They can't say, this is the viewpoints we favor, so we're funding these. These are the people we don't like, so we're censoring them. That's what the First Amendment strips from the power of government. But it's not like, oh, it's illegitimate to do that. No, private individuals, as private individuals, should be doing that. And that's part of what the freedom that the First Amendment gives us. It's the freedom to precisely do that. Because the issue is so important, it can't be an issue left to the government and the coercion of the government. It has to be an issue that you, as a private individual, thinking about the issues, make decisions about. So far from if Heritage just had said, no, what Tucker Carlson is doing, we regard this as beyond the pale. We don't want to be associated with this. Yes, we had past support and ties to Tucker Carlson. We're now severing this. And that's part of like some of their intellectuals and donors. That's in effect what they're demanding. Far from that being a violation of the First Amendment, that is an exercise of the freedom that the First Amendment protects. It's precisely that you have the freedom to do this. And if you're a moral and rational person, you should be doing this. And you might make mistakes about a particular individual. But the idea that this kind of discrimination, and I'm going to use the term because, we discriminate. Yes, you discriminate. If you think a viewpoint is evil or irrational, you should discriminate against it in favor of viewpoints and people and organizations that you think are rational and good. So that's it's almost the reverse of the truth when they say, we don't want to engage in and I think in terms of Roberts doing this, it was a part of cop-out of a way of not having to really take a position on Tucker Carlson and like, what do you think that he's doing? And I actually view of what that interview with Fuentes, I think more evil than the anti-Semitism, and there is that, and sort of. I actually think the being anti-Israel is in many ways worse than the anti-Semitism is a long form of racism. It's really evil. But there's a way in which you can default in this. When you turn against, so your racial heritage should be irrelevant to yourself and to other people. Like who are my ancestors? I don't care. It doesn't matter intellectually or morally about who I am and what I do. But attacking Israel, it's almost always attacked for what's good about it. So it's not just you're focused on some irrelevant characteristic to which you're ascribing moral significance. Oh, you're bad because you're Jewish. It's Israel's being attacked for something that it's good, that it's a free society, a prosperous society in the Middle East, which is a sea of dictatorships. And if you're really like, that's who you're going to attack in the Middle East, and you don't really care about Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Iran, so there's something really warped. And even worse than that was for their view of women, so Tucker pushed back a little bit about like, how can you be against all the Jews and why can't you just be criticizing Israel's government? So it was not a very heated or strong pushback. There was the view about women and it would be, I think, charitable to say like their view is women's place is in the kitchen. It's way worse than that. There was no pushback at all. And so instead of Roberts having to really confront these issues and say, well, we don't engage in cancel culture. We're for the First Amendment. We're not going to be against the Constitution. That's a cop-out. And the idea of cancel culture, that it gives cover to that. No, you have a moral and intellectual responsibility to say, what is your stand here? Like, what do you think about these ideas and these people and what they're doing? And you can't cop out and say, we don't censor people. No, government censors or not. You don't.
And there's also a bit of non-judgmentalism there, which is it should be at least alien to the conservatives. When you say, we're not canceling anyone for any reason, it's like you say, we don't judge.
Nikos,
Elana, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to say something about that because you raised in your setup to the question, there doesn't seem to be any gatekeeping. What happened? Is this a movement? And I think there's at least two things going on. I agree with the characterization that is implied in your comment that the conservative movement is bankrupt of ideas. It's sort of intellectually empty. And I think this is some of the evidence of it, that there isn't really thinking about these issues. And this idea of, is it non-judgmental? I don't think that's quite how I would think of it. I think it's in the absence of ideas, it's become even more tribal. And the tribalism is, well, there are no enemies to the right. That's essentially what we heard from Roberts. And that is something that's been happening over decades. I mean, Ayn Rand's analysis of the conservatives 60 years ago was that they were intellectually bankrupt. And I think what we've seen in the years since then is just confirmation of that over and over and over. Two elements of why, what's illustrating that. One, this idea that we're not going to look at him. We're not going to look at what he said. This is the cop-out that you're talking about, Onkar, where cancel culture becomes a way to, well, we don't want to look over there. We don't want to see what he's saying. How dare you accuse us of being like the other tribe, like the left? They do that stuff. That's not us. We don't do that. And that's just that's a dodge for considering both the nature of the interview, what was said, who's involved in it. And it's despicable. I mean, I have to tell you, I've been listening, and I watched the interview. I'm embarrassed that this is something we have to talk about. It's deplorable that this is the state of the culture, that Tucker Carlson has the biggest platform on the conservative side of the landscape, and Fuentes is apparently has a huge following. This is embarrassing. So one piece of it is just this non-judgmental, he's part of our tribe, how dare you? And it is a tribal gatekeeping. So this is the other element of it, which is there's a leaked video, and there's reporting about this video that Roberts had in the Heritage Foundation, where all the staff were upset. There was a town hall meeting. Part of what's fascinating about that is the staff are better than he is intellectually. A lot of them, with their criticisms of him and their questions, not all of them, some of them are supportive. But part of what you get is they're confused. The conservative movement used to do this on more intellectual grounds, but we're not doing that now. What are you talking about? Of course, we kicked out the John Birch Society, we kicked out other anti-Semites, we kicked out all kinds of groups and people, and that was part of what is required of any intellectual movement. There has to be some sense of who's in and who's aligned with the ideas, but there isn't that. And Roberts, this is the telling piece of what Roberts said. Why? What is the agenda for Tucker? Tucker is trying to connect with Fuentes and draw on his audience. And why is Heritage? What are the two pressures that Heritage had? Well, we have people who want us to be with Tucker and people who want us to connect with Fuentes' audience. And the rationale is we're trying to peel away the young, disaffected men. That's what I was trying to do with my support for Tucker. There are contexts where there's a bad movement and you think you can peel away better people who haven't yet figured out what's going on. There can be such a thing. But I don't think that's really what's going on. I think this is more evidence of, we get the young people are basically racist and tribal, and that what they're attracted by is this Fuentes. We need those people in our movement. It's a kind of reverse. It's opening the gates to a certain kind of view. And that's the sense in which there is gatekeeping. Gatekeeping isn't just kicking people out. It's inviting people in and telling them they have a place here and we want you to be here. And that's why Tucker's whole approach to that interview is to normalize. And that's the important piece. It's just, there's nothing crazy about this guy. And in some ways, if you watch Fuentes' own show, he comes across like a lunatic. Like, he's so intense. And you think he's articulate, intense, and young. And I get why people, but he sounds like he's deranged. When he shows up on Tucker, presumably they had dinner before, and Tucker told him what to expect. He comes across much more civilized. And Tucker goes out of his way to help him with that, coaching him. Well, dude, why can't you just recognize that in Christianity, we don't believe in the blood giving guilt, isn't that what original guilt is about? Original sin? Never mind. But the whole idea is he's coaching him how to come across as less irrational and less evil. And so you can see that. So the agenda here in the background isn't that there isn't gatekeeping. How could they? It's that they want these people in the movement. This is part of what they think is the future of the conservative movement. That's part of why it's despicable, because it was chosen and it was recognized.
And actually, Nick Fuentes, my prediction is that he's rediscovering himself as a Christian nationalist. And he said he used this term to the Tucker interview because he sees that this is where the conservatives are going. So this is his way of saying, "Oh, I'm just one of you. I just want Christian morality to influence state policy."
Before you go to the next section, I wanted to add something to what
Sure.
Elon just says.
Yeah, and I wanted to say a few things too.
Part out.
Go ahead.
I want to follow up about what Elon said about the intellectual bankruptcy of the conservative movement as a something that explains why there seem to be so few standards left for judging who's associated with it. Part of the reason I pushed back earlier, Nikos, against your Buckley example to try to make the point that it's not like he's the standard that we should all uphold for deciding when to associate with someone or when not to. He's an example that's been much discussed recently in connection with this controversy, and it's usually he's been brought up by critics of Roberts and critics of Carlson as the person we should exemplify. And there's this article from Eli Lake that I was quoting before is one of the examples. This was in the Free Press, and what he says is basically Buckley's model from the middle to late 20th century of the way he allegedly policed the conservative movement. That's the one we should all be holding up and emulating. And he gives the example, yes, how in the early 1960s, Buckley kicked the John Birch Society conspiracy theorists out of at least his sector of the conservative movement. And he also then later on in the 1990s tried to ostracize Pat Buchanan, the kind of America First nationalist isolationist types. That's all well and good, but let's also not forget that in the early 1960s, late 1950s even, Buckley was also instrumental in ostracizing Ayn Rand from the conservative movement at the time. And he did so by, many people have read this review that Whittaker Chambers published in the National Review, which smeared Ayn Rand's philosophy, called her a materialist and an advocate of genocide, in effect. Go to the gas chambers go is the line that he said he heard out of every page of Atlas Shrugged. Complete smear. And like that is itself an example of kind of religious heretic hunting, what Buckley was engaging in. And it's very significant, I think, that Chambers was criticizing Rand for being an atheist. Basically saying we can't have atheists in our midst. We need to maintain our Judeo-Christian values. And so, I mean, that's the intellectual bankruptcy. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that when, in effect, religion is your standard of what's tolerable, you end up becoming tolerant of religious witch hunts yourself and try to assimilate your criticism of religious witch hunts on the left to simply respecting free speech, when in fact you're not really opposed to the essence of what quote-unquote cancel culture stands for, which is just more of these religious witch hunts. So the model here is not Buckley. And the fact that the way he policed the movement was in favor of this kind of Judeo-Christian religion, I mean, I think that's what's responsible for the bankruptcy today and what has made the movement increasingly tribalistic. I'll talk about.
Yeah, to go back to a couple of other things that Alon brought up. So he brought up the leaked recording from a Heritage internal meeting. Now, I've actually watched that recording. I did it. I resisted doing it because I view it as like, this is a leaked recording. This is a private conversation. It's not in the public domain. But once political figures, including the vice president, are weighing in on the issue, in order to evaluate the political figures and to think, you have to know what they're talking about. And the fact that this was leaked, it's now like it's public in that sense and people are talking about it. So then I watched it to know, like, well, I want to see for myself what they're talking about, what they're weighing in on. But I did it with some trepidation because it is like, it's not right for employees to leak private meetings from an organization. So to say that, but if you listen to it, I think Alon said something like there's people at Heritage who are better than the president. I think, and this has been commented on, and again, so like is that commentary accurate? You have to listen to the recording to hear some of it. I think there's a real split between older people at Heritage are much better than younger people at Heritage. And then if you're thinking of the direction in which Heritage and the conservatives and the political right, as it would be called in America, are moving, that's relevant to know that the younger people coming into seem to like have unquestioning support for Roberts, and we love you and we love what you're doing. That's significant. Cause I agree with Ben. Buckley's I don't like Buckley. I certainly would not emulate him. And not just, but certainly in part because of his treatment of Ayn Rand and what he did. But there's other things that I don't like. But in comparison to where it seems to be, in comparison to Roberts and the support, I'd take Buckley over that. And so this is a downward trajectory. And in terms of thinking about so Alon was talking about like how vile the Fuentes positions are and the way in which they were being made to look more rational, the product of judgment. You might think the judgment in the end is wrong, but that there's real thinking there and a reasonable attempt to arrive at positions and so on, that there's a kind of sanitizing of it. In terms of thinking about the political right and including the pushback against Carlson, you have to get that Trump is one of the people who has helped mainstream Fuentes. He had dinner with him, and this comes up in the conversation with Carlson about, oh, you had dinner with Kanye West and Trump, and you can see the effect that it had on Fuentes, and you can then think of like he now has like millions of people like our president treats him as respectable and somebody to get advice from. Like, I want to hear what you have to say, and and then as he reports the conversation, he's telling to Trump to Kanye West, oh yeah, he really seems to get it, and that is, if our president treats this person as a legitimate figure and someone you can learn from and so on, that is part of the main. And if the political right and conservatives were doing some real soul search and worried about anti-Semitism, it would be Trump is enabling this, and that he comes out now in support of and dodges behind, and it's a complete dodge. I don't know who Fuentes is. He still doesn't know. Like, he had dinner with him in 2022. There's this controversy, and he still doesn't know that he didn't find it necessary. Because some people called him out when he had dinner with Fuentes about, do you know who this is? And this is a rabid anti-Semite. And it's Trump's responsibility, just as an individual, certainly as the president of the United States, to, if it were really true, I don't know anything about, to have now looked into who is it. He could have denounced him after the fact of having dinner, that he still doesn't know who he is, and it's a dodge. And will the conservative movement confront that fact? It's relatively easy, but you can already see how hard it is for them to try to distance themselves from Tucker Carlson because he has a big platform and so on. But some did it, like Ted Cruz, and there's some others, and people leaving Heritage. Like, will they do it in regard to Trump? That you've helped mainstream anti-Semitism. And my experience is they will all run for cover that, oh no, look what Trump's done for Israel and so on. Yeah, but look at the way in which he helps legitimize anti-Semites. And what's really important is to see the effect that it has on Fuentes. Like, if you're trying to understand the causal dynamics here, and I think in the last episode, Fuentes tweeted something like, "Thank you, Mr. President," and like that's real. And if you think about the followers of Fuentes, it's, oh yeah, like our president treats this person as a respectable. So how can you say he's beyond the pale?
And Onkar, you mentioned the generational division. There was a comment by another prominent person in the New Right. He said something like, I think it was Rodrege. He said that a big percentage of staffers in Washington they identify as groypers, that many of the young people who are these days in the conservative movement are groypers. Groypers are the followers of Nick Fuentes. So we can't be sure if it's 30%, 40%, but there's no question there is some appeal there. So we mentioned tribalism. So let us try to explain to people how do these people think? How do the people like Nick Fuentes and his followers? So if you follow their interviews, you'll hear them often say things like, oh, we are white nationalists because the reality is that different groups fight with each other and different groups have a conflicting interest. So you have to stand up for your group and you have to stick to your group. And I hear this and I think, wait a minute, this rings a bell. Because of course, this is the typical worldview that we've seen all these years taught in our universities by leftist professors. Of course, they were not talking about ethnic or racial groups. They're talking about classes or actually they were talking about races, about oppressed racial groups. And also, if you watch the interviews of Nick Fuentes, you'll notice that often he opens his sentences with a preamble, as a white Christian American, I believe X. And of course, I thought, yes, I've heard this before. Isn't this how the woke academics would preface everything that they would say with things like, as a woman of color, I think X, or as an LGBT man, I believe X. So the worldview of this new right, groyper right, however you want to call it, their worldview oozes of one thing, and this is tribalism. Tribalism. And by tribalism, I mean you view yourself, you view others, and you view the world through the prism of groups that are in conflict with each other. So these people make sense of reality through the prism of their identity and through the prism of the group. And unfortunately, this was to be expected because this is how kids have been taught for decades in schools and universities. This is how they've been taught to think, or maybe not to think. And we see the results in front of us with the groypers. So it looks like it is tribalism on the one side, tribalism on the other side. Tribalism is the only game in town, people.
I just want to say something about the Fuentes interview, which is that it's not just that he prefaces his statements with "as a white Christian male." It's worse than that. So here are a couple of passages from that interview, and I should mention these go uncontested by Tucker. Tucker, as Ankar points out, does ask some questions about other things that Fuentes says, but not these. He says, we do need to be exclusive, not inclusive. We do on some level need to be pro-white, not to the exclusion of everybody else, but recognizing that white people have special heritage here as Americans. Now, he's got the fig leaf of not to the exclusion of everybody else, but what's the special heritage that white people have as Americans just because some of us have lived here for a while, even while indigenous tribes have lived here longer? What's the special heritage? Or here's another one. You cannot actually divorce Israel and the neocons from Jewishness, ethnicity, religion, identity. Identity politics is a reality that we live in a world of Jews and Christians, whites and blacks. These identities mean something to us and they mean things to each other and we can't sort of wish them away. Now, there are other fig leaves in that interview where both Tucker and Fuentes talk about how, they reject collectivism, and it's not collectivist to hold the views that they hold, but I defy them to explain why what I just quoted isn't collectivism in its most raw form, that when you see the world in terms of these warring groups, as you pointed out, Nikos, he's not just prefacing his statements with as a white Christian male, he's saying, I can't escape my identity as a white Christian male, and nobody can escape their identity. Jews can't escape their Jewishness. Their identity as such is what determines their outlook on the world and who they're in conflict with and what they have to stand up for and how we apparently, in his case, have to stand up against them.
Onkar and Elan, let me also mention one more thing here. Sorry. This tribalism, this idea that there's no enemies to the right. Yesterday or the day before, Donald Trump denounced one of his former allies, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And it's interesting that he used the term, she's a traitor. He didn't say she's wrong, or he didn't say she was unfair to me. He said, she's a traitor. So this is tribalism at its purest, right? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying you turn against the team, you turn against the tribe. This is almost like how hooligans or the mafia operates, which says you need to have omerta, you need to have perfect loyalty, otherwise you're a traitor. This is the language of tribalism.
I just want to add one thing to this characterization of tribalism, which I think is helpful. You're putting it here, you're relating it to the mafia and hooligans and gangs. What I take from Ayn Rand's analysis of tribalism is that the phenomenon we see in civilized societies, so leave aside some more primitive societies, the version that we see is, in her analysis, essentially a cognitive failure, cognitive default. So when you hear people talk about we don't have enemies to the right, what that means is we don't want to think and judge, we just want to have a group. And it's essentially not a cognitive position. It's not that the tribalist is really thinking about, well, what's the right thing to do here? The questions of right and wrong, true and false, are not questions that they care about. They care about in the deep way in which any individual should care about them. It's fundamentally anti-idealistic. It's against any fundamental values in life. And this is a really crucial aspect to appreciate about tribalism, to recognize about tribalism. That is why it's loyalty and betrayal versus she's wrong. It's you don't want to have enemies to your right. Well, the right is in some sense a tribe in their mind. And so you want to keep it strong. You want to grow it. You want to make it bigger and more powerful. And power here means physical power, numbers, literally. Not, we have the best arguments, so we're going to win people over. It's, we have the most people. And this, when you think of it as anti-conceptual, anti-thought, anti-mind, this is the key to seeing why it's not about the positions. It's not about logic or convincing. I don't think their views are held insofar as you can say they have views. I don't think they're held as, I've convinced myself that this race is beneath contempt. That's not how it stands. It's emotional. It's authority-based. None of these things are based on thought, real concern for facts and truth, what is right and what is wrong. That's part of what's important to see. And this is the sense in which tribalism is a regression. It's a step really far back to more primitive modes of existing. So they both were, Fuentes wore a suit and Tucker wore clothes that you would see anyone, but fundamentally they're really primitive in the way they approach life and the way they think. And that's true also of, I think, the deplorable behavior of Roberts at Heritage. So that's really key, that it's anti-thought, anti-truth, anti-values. And it helps to understand the ways in which they behave and why loyalty and cohesion are so valued.
Onkar, parting thoughts on the issue of tribalism?
Yes, so that the roots of it are, so Alon was saying it's anti-intellectual, it's anti-thought, it's anti-reason. If you look at it from the other direction, what then are you pushing? What you're pushing is faith. You're pushing faith, and then you push some version of determinism that you actually can't. There's no such thing as really thinking, reasoning. We're all products of forces beyond our control. And racism then becomes one prominent way. We're a product of our ancestors and our genetic lineage and so on. That's what explains what's significant about me, what's significant about you, why we belong together or in conflict, because we've got supposedly common or close heritage, or we're at very distance. And so that's what they push on the positive side that helps then, that what you get is, reason's a myth. Nobody can think, and there's no such thing really as the individual. We're all products of, we're all deterministic products of our environment. And when you think of the Western culture, American culture, everybody pushes this. So when it got to the level of the woke, people got the idea there's something racist here in the way they talk about so-called anti-racism of the Abram Kindi and so on. People got or eventually got to there's something really tribal racist about it, which there was. And then in regard to woke, you had people writing, this is like a religion. It's like faith. Arguments don't matter anymore. That's true as well. But it's also true of the conservatives and the political right. And in this sense, Heritage has been pushing tribalism for a long period of time, and all the way back to somebody like Buckley, and it goes further back. If you push faith, family, and tradition, that's a recipe for tribalism. I mean, what you're pushing is faith. Like it's you don't reach conclusions by reasoning, by argument, by evidence. What you need is faith. That and Buckley and Heritage and the conservatives have pushed that for so long. Family, and Ayn Rand commented on this, and she put it like something, the weird emphasis they put on family. It's not like if you have a good family, you will and good parents as well, you will really appreciate what they did for you, what they made possible in your life, and so on. So there is, like, if you have semi-decent parents and siblings, there's a real basis for why you would love your immediate family. But family in the way, like that family trumps everything is the tribal perspective. It's a loyalty. It's my family, right or wrong, because they're tied to me by blood and by genes. And so, like, that's what really matters. And the more the conservatives push, well, what family, that's what really matters. That's what morality comes from. And so that's pushing tribalism. And tradition is if something, you think something's good because it's old. Like you can't evaluate it, but it's been around for a long time, so it must be good. That's again, like you can't think, you just have to accept something because it's in the distant past. So that's how tribalists think. It's we really care about when they talk about the Balkans as tribal, they seem to care like what happened 600 years ago, some war was fought and your ancestors offended my ancestors, so I hate you now 600 years later. And so that's like the worship of tradition. And this is what the conservatives has pushed. It's not only the conservatives. So academia and the universities have pushed this in a different way, but everybody's pushing tribalism in one way or another. And then people are going to wonder, like we've descended into tribalism and we don't like it and there's something that's gone wrong. Yeah, but you've been educating people in this way for generations, and unfortunately the chickens are coming home to roost. And that's true on the left, but it's also true on the right. And so some of the better people, for instance, at Heritage, of saying, look, isn't anti-Semitism beyond the pale? And so unfortunately, they've helped push ideas that push tribalism. And so they should not be surprised that this is where we're ending up.
So, Ben, I'm sure there are better educational institutions out there for people who want to defend freedom, no?
I have one in mind. I mean, on the note that Onkar sounded about the way that Heritage has been training conservatives for tribalism because of its embrace of religion and tradition and so forth. Well, if there are any disaffected sponsors of Heritage out there who don't like the direction in which this has gone and want to understand what is the alternative, I mean, let me just point to the ways in which our organization, the Ayn Rand Institute, stands as in stark opposition to this approach. So this whole controversy began because of a controversy about anti-Semitism. And it's worth pointing out that the Ayn Rand Institute has been very critical of anti-Semitism over the years, and in particular has been a principled defender of what's good about Israel. And Onkar mentioned earlier why it's the attacks on Israel are really the greater crime here than just anti-Semitism as such, as bad as anti-Semitism is. And Ilan has a book, What Justice Demands, outlining why one can make a rational defense of what's good about Israel in principled philosophic terms. And notably, in ways that are different from some of the kinds of tribalistic defenses of Israel that you sometimes hear. It's not that Israel's good because it's Jewish. It's good because it's a defender of civilization and of individual freedom in a region otherwise dominated by statism, slavery, and tribalism. And of course, that is a central point of Ayn Rand's philosophy, that individualism is is the central and fundamental principle, moral principle, on which to assess civilization versus barbarism, which to defend civilization against primitivism. It's for this same reason that we stand up for America, as Ankar alluded, not because it's a tradition, but because America was a great achievement, the first nation to be founded on a moral principle, the principle of individual rights, not just out of tribalistic concerns. And all of this comes down to why the Ayn Rand Institute takes morality, the morality of individualism, the morality of the pursuit of happiness, so seriously, and underscores why we are in fact concerned with evaluating political movements in terms of moral principles, judging whether or not to associate ourselves with individuals or organizations on the basis of their attitude toward these moral principles, not just about whether or not we have a common enemy. And if these are the kinds of principles that you're interested in as well, check us out. Go to aynrand.org/donate. And if you want to understand some of the issues we've been talking about today even better, I can't recommend a better place to look than a talk that you gave 2 years ago at our 2024 conference, the Objectivist Conference, OCON. There's a video of this on YouTube of your talk on moral sanction, where you talk about why ARI has taken the issue of judging morally who you associate with and who you end up sanctioning so seriously that some people see this as a kind of niche controversy inside objectivism. But I think the kinds of things we talked about today show this is not just a niche issue. It's a question of general applicability, of general importance. And in this talk, Ankar also it shows how the same issue comes up in how we think about the left, and how people properly decided how to evaluate universities for how they treated protesters themselves who were protesting against Israel. And there's questions about how do you sanction the sanctioners of the sanctioners, and they're not at all trivial. They cut to the core of many of the controversies in politics we're talking about today, and this has been something that ARI has been keenly attuned to over years, if not decades.
And on that note, many thanks to our viewers. See you soon.